Hi, Robin here, looking at legal, moral, cultural and ethical issues. This is for the OCR A-Level Computer Science. I'm going to be looking at censorship and the internet. So with censorship, it's that freedom to say what you want, and censorship is therefore somebody trying to stop you saying that. And therefore, things like the Data Protection Act and the more modern day GDPR regulations, certainly the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, some Computer Misuse Acts as well, certainly the Online Safety Act is kind of an update of that, would all kind of impact on what you can say and do on the internet and how that's appropriate. Again, there's things like the Communications Decency Act, which is in America, Digital Services Act in the EU, which again are kind of about how online and social media sort of things will impact on people. Again, there's what we call a Great Firewall of China, where internet is censoring what websites can be used by people in China and the behaviours of that. So there's quite a few aspects around this. And again, note that some of these laws are not necessarily in the OCR spec, but I do think there's something that you should be aware exists, and it's something you can still talk about in what's going on with this. So around kind of the ethical considerations of that, there's a fine line, isn't there, between what we call free speech and what we would consider hate speech, and therefore what's appropriate, and where does that line come? And obviously this is very much up to the courts to decide where that line exists, and politicians really to decide. And again, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Things like AI could easily start to censor people massively, and therefore should be controlled about how that goes on. But again, we have government issues and political issues around kind of what's appropriate and when's it appropriate to prevent people from speaking out. Again, ultimately, there's a big aspect around who decides this. Ultimately, in many ways, it should be the governments that decide. But equally, companies are deciding at the moment. Again, we've kind of got governments that are using companies like Microsoft, Google, etc. To kind of use their technology. So, and again, there's a grey area here as to whether it's the company Microsoft who makes the decision, or is it the government that should control that. And again, this is where there's an issue between laws being up to date enough to put the correct processes in place. And it's a little bit of a grey area at the moment in a way, and it's kind of a disadvantage, if you like, of technology developing and improving so quickly. Again, we've got the whole kind of access to information aspect to this, and should internet access be considered a human right? Is it a privilege to be able to get onto the internet? There's a whole kind of grey area around this about where the line actually lies and when is it appropriate and when is it not. There are moral considerations to this. So obviously people need to share information so that they know that, say, a government is acting in an inappropriate way, or that there's behaviours that such as sort of social disorders that can be kind of come from, say, misinformation and the misuse of information. And therefore it's appropriate that there is some try and attempt to at least hold the truth, isn't there? And making sure that harmful content isn't getting out there and isn't sort of having a negative impact on people, and particularly children with that. Again, there's a whole aspect around power. If power in many ways comes from social media, and an influencer can be deemed to have power based on what they say and how that influences other people. And again, the behaviours of those people online. So what are they actually saying? Are they being offensive? Are they sort of being derogatory in some way? And again, what kind of aspects have been put in place for that? Culturally, there are obviously different attitudes to this all around the world, really. So such as the Nordic countries that will promote very much internet freedom, and it's very much up to the individual, versus places like China, where there's very strict rules about who can do and say what and where online. Again, online expression, so different sexualities and religious beliefs, etc., may be acceptable in some cultures, but then not in others. And again, how that's handled and how that's deemed appropriate and managed. A whole sort of aspects around social media and the censorship of movements. So, for example, there's been the Me Too movement, and again, kind of making sure that that's been allowed to be out there and be deemed as okay and not be shut down by governments, etc., and tech companies, and the whole process around the sort of the morality of that in many ways. And again, things like where sort of information has been banned or been disallowed in some way because it's not deemed as acceptable by that particular culture that it's in. Okay, well, thank you for watching. I really hope you found that useful. Please do like and subscribe, and I'll hope to see you again.